bring John McMullen into the conversation. John McMullen, would you say Eric Snow is one of the top point guards in the history of the Philadelphia 76ers franchise?
No, I would not.
Just making sure that I'm not crazy, that's all. I'm being told that Eric Snow is a top 10 point guard in the franchise's history.
Well, top 10? I mean, maybe top 10.
Maybe. But still a debate.
But, yeah, when you're talking about Maurice Cheeks would obviously be at the top. He's going into the Basketball Hall of Fame. There's Eric had a nice little run there, especially as a defensive player. He's a heck of a defensive player.
By the way, I'm taking Andre Miller ahead of Eric Snow.
Andre was a much
Drew Holiday ahead of Eric Snow.
Drew was a much better player. I think you have to go into longevity and team success as well. Yeah. And obviously Eric was on. For a younger generation, Eric was the point guard on the only good team they've ever known. So I think it gets a little bit overvalued.
That's right.
Let's put it that way.
Yeah. And by the way, John covered the NBA for how many years?
Long time. I'm too old. I can't do the math anymore.
Yeah. Well, Eric Snow wasn't good then either.
Good defensive player. Very good.
He was. He was a steady influence next to Allen there.
Tremendous at taking the charge. That's the brilliance what Larry Brown did. He got a bunch of role players to get around Allen Iverson because Allen wasn't going to change the way he played. So you had to get a bunch of unselfish guys who didn't care about shooting the basketball, would do all the dirty work, and they were able to do it for a very short time, and Eric Snow was a big part of that.
Let's look at the new class of Eagles here. And, now that the dust is kind of settled and we want to sit down, I want to kind of look at the different positions here. I want to start with the running back spot. They signed, last year they brought Corey Clement in, and they went to the undrafted rookie free agent again. They went down that road again with Josh Adams, the Notre Dame kid. So when you put him in and now the new running back room, how do you kind of look at that, as we now get to the next phase of this offseason, which will be coming to the mini camps and the training camp? What's that running back room and competition going to look like?
Well, I think you have the three clear guys, and that's Jay Ajayi, Corey Clement, and Darren Sproles. And then from there, you have a couple young players fighting for their roster lives, and that'll be Wendell Smallwood and Donnell Pumphrey. And Josh Adams will be in that mix. Josh Adams, it's weird as an undrafted player, but he's probably got more talent than both of those guys. Not probably, certainly does. And I think it'll depend on a number of things, as it always does with back end of the roster players. Maybe their ability to help on special teams, which none of the three has ever really done before.
Right.
The ability to catch the ball out of the backfield. If Pumphrey is able to put on some weight, is able to show he's more of an NFL player from a measurable standpoint, he'd probably have the advantage there. If the Eagles want to replace LeGarrette Blount in a big back, to give them that sort of look, well, then Adams is going to have the advantage. So if they want a kick returner, then Smallwood would have the advantage. So a lot of it depends on how they want to build the back end of their roster.
Pumphrey, they drafted him last year, and there was some excitement about him and that he was going to be the new Darren Sproles, but now Sproles is back. So what's that mean for him?
Well, it's not good, that's for sure. I can say, Donnell's going to be one of those guys we're going to have a close eye on when we finally get to see them on the field in May, later this month, because he did not look like an NFL player from a physical standpoint last year. And he was a big disappointment after showing some skills in OTAs. When there's no pads on, there's a big difference. You can look good in space when you're a 170-pound kid and nobody can beat you up and hit you. And as soon as the pads came on, he didn't look like an NFL player. Mm-hmm. So he's going to be one of those off-season storylines to watch got to get bigger. He's got to get stronger. Otherwise, he's not going to make this football team.
Johnny Mac's with us here. John McMullen breaking down the new look roster now that the draft is behind us and these guys are in. So let's go to tight end where they drafted Dallas Goedert. And now, does he automatically go to the number 2 spot? They brought in Rodgers. How do you look at that tight end now? Because that position definitely has a new look to it.
Yeah, no, I think he goes to the Trey Burton spot as the move tight end, sort of the backup move tight end to Zach Ertz, and Richard Rodgers fits into the Brent Selleck role because I explained a little bit on yesterday's show. It's difficult to play 2 tight ends if one of them can't block, and right now, Goddard doesn't. He wasn't asked to do that in college. And Zach's not very good at it. That's obviously the deficiency of his game. They're both really good receivers. The better part for Goddard, at least, unlike Trey Burton, Trey was a very small guy for a tight end, whereas Dallas is not. So he at least has the frame to eventually turn into a willing blocker, and maybe even a competent one down the road, but the Eagles are going to have to sort of teach him how to do that. And for now, Richard Rodgers, who is, again, not the greatest blocker either, but he's been asked to do it in the past. He can be competent at it. Very similar to Goddard. He's got a very big frame, so at least you have that part of it. But that's one of the few weaknesses on this team as you look at the off-season roster, the fact that they don't have a tight end that blocks very well.
Let's go over to the wide receiver story, because yesterday, right when you got done talking to us, we got a chance to see that Nelson Aguilar, the Eagles exercised Nelson Aguilar's 5th-year option, which, if you would have talked about this 2 years ago, you probably would have never predicted that this could have happened. But the option is worth $9.3 million, so he's guaranteed based on injury or anything. That's a lot of money now for Nelson Aguilar all of a sudden. So you look at the Eagles wide receiver, and they didn't bring anybody into the draft, so they're pretty happy with what they have. It looks like.
Yeah, he had a very good season last year. I think they found the way to utilize him properly, and that's in the slot. And that will continue to be his role as Alshon Jeffrey and Mike Wallace come in. They'll handle most of the work outside the numbers. So he had a very good season. I always say I don't think he's ever going to be the guy who's, Chris Carter catches everything. He doesn't have the greatest hands in the world, but he is a tremendous athlete. He's a good route runner. He gets open. And I think he's gotten over that mental hump. And the Eagles, this was sort of a no-brainer. You're right. If we talked about this time last year, we would have said probably they're not going to pick up the 5th-year option. But after the year you had to. And it just basically gives you the extra year of team control. I don't believe ultimately the Eagles will pay Nelson Aguilar $9.3 million next year. I think they'll work out an extension at some point, and this just gives them a little bit more security. And it really doesn't. The only way that money is guaranteed is if Nelson is injured. And the Eagles basically have until next March, second or third day of the league year, to decide are we going to pay this or not, and they can bow out of the contract. So if he has a terrible season, they could still bow out and not have to pay him. But more likelihood, as I said, he's gotten over the hump. He's going to be an effective player again, and they'll work out an extension that sort of lowers that cap.
Now, the fact that they didn't draft anybody, now they only had 5 picks, to my knowledge. Right, they really couldn't. I don't know what the undrafted list looks like, but does that say that maybe Matt Collins or, Shelton Gibson, they did draft last year? They do have Greg Ward. Bryce Treggs, is he still on the roster? I guess he's still hanging around
Bryce
there. I mean, does that say that
one? But now he's back.
Right. Does that say that one of those guys, that somebody I just mentioned, might have to play somewhat of a role next year, or that they're comfortable with Mac?
No, well, I mean, they're in the same position they were last year. It's just that Mike Wallace replaces Torrey Smith, which is a slight, probably more than a slight upgrade. He's a better player than Torrey, and I think he will provide more production than Torrey did. So Mac will continue to be the fourth receiver, and then Shelton is in that fifth slot, and he'll try to hold off some of those names you mentioned. So it's really status quo, and that's not a surprise because Mack and Shelton are both second-year players, so they're very young. They're still developing. They still have some upside, especially Hollins. The Eagles think highly of him, but he's probably not ready to take on a starting role yet, and that's why they brought Wallace in. But they do like his possibility of getting to that point in the future. So it was a good group last year, and it's slightly improved, and but it probably will be status quo unless someone like Greg Ward or Bryce Treggs, as you mentioned, can push Shelton Gibson off the roster.
John, Peters, Wisniewski, Kelsey, Brooks, Lane Johnson, all signed. Will they be the five on the field on opening day or Thursday night?
Barring injury, of course, which
Sure.
we always say. Yeah, Jason's back, and he'll be the left tackle. And Wiz kind of proved himself last year. Those are the only two question marks. Obviously, from center to the right side, you got All-Pro, Pro Bowler, All-Pro. So they're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Kelsey, Brooks, Johnson, that's the best right side in football. And I'll tell you, this team won the Super Bowl. We always talk about it. And they're adding, essentially, from the team that won in Minneapolis and beat the Patriots, they're adding Carson Wentz, Jason Peters, Darren Sproles, and Jordan Hicks. So somewhere Doug Peterson's smiling
right
as he gets ready to publish his memoir.
Right. Well, when we flip over to defense, you've got Brandon Graham, Michael Bennett, Derek Barnett, Chris Long, Josh Sweat as your defensive end. So it's going to be a pretty competitive camp, you would say, with that group.
Yeah, how deep is that group? And that's why I said Josh Sweat. I think he's the biggest value pick the Eagles had in this draft. He's got a lot of upside if he can prove to be healthy. I think
when you say that, is they drafted like Alex McAllister from Florida a couple of years ago. Is he akin to that, or is he better than more of a prospect?
He's much better than that.
Okay,
McAllister was a 6'6" guy who weighed 235 pounds. He looked like, I always joked at the time, Dorial Green Beckham was still here, the wide receiver who's 6'5", 230. They were basically the same guy, frame-wise. And as big as Dorial was, he's not playing defensive end in the NFL, even in this era, because people will just push him around. That was the issue with McAllister. Sweat is much more of a traditional edge player. His body is equipped for it. He played out of position at Florida State. They asked him to play a lot of four technique. He's going to be thrilled to be playing a lot of wide nine with Jim Schwartz. He can get after the quarterback. I think ultimately he'll be a pretty good pass rusher in this league. It ain't going to happen in 2018, though. Not with Graham and Bennett and Long and Barnett. And don't forget Stephen Means, because Stephen Means can play as well. They are extremely deep at that position.
And then the tackle spot's pretty darn deep, too. When you break it down, you've got Jernigan and Fletcher, and they brought in Haloti Ngata, and they still have Vallejo and Qualls. So the tackle spot, they really, probably upgraded there.
Yeah, I agree, even though same thing with defensive end they upgraded, because bottom line is Bennett is better than Vinnie Curry. and Nada is better than Bo Allen.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they're both aging players. They're both over 30, and they both don't have long shelf lives. But still, the way they played, and Nada's got to prove he's healthy, but the last time he was on the field, that's a good player. That's nothing against Bo Allen, who I thought was underrated, but they're not in the same category, and Vinny's not in the same category as Michael Bennett. So if anything, what was the strength of this team, if you looked at probably before the Carson Wentz injury, if you looked at the two biggest strengths, you would say quarterback, defensive line, they're even better, at least on paper, as far as the defensive line goes.
John McMullen, let's look at the you mentioned Hicks before. They're going to get him back. Warlow behind him. Bradham, they brought in, Corey Nelson. You got Kendricks.
Still got Michael Kendricks.
Right, they still got Kendricks.
Still got him.
So the linebacking core, which was really they lost Hicks last year, was really a two-man thing. I mean, Walker came in. He ended up getting hurt. They really had two guys. Is the linebacking core is better than it was last year.
Oh, sure. I mean, Jordan is one of the biggest playmaking linebackers in football when he's healthy. He's proven that. The issues with him are all health-related. 2 of his 3 seasons obviously cut in half, essentially, by injuries. So he's got to find a way to stay on the field. But he's proven when he's on the field, he makes plays, and that's just the way it is. So I thought Michael Kendricks did a wonderful job sort of fitting in that role as one of the 2-3 down linebackers when Jordan got hurt, but Jordan's just better. So from that standpoint, again, that's the improvement with Bradham, and they have much more depth because you're right. When Joe Walker went down and they weren't happy with the way he was playing anyway, they had to go on the street in December to get Donnell Ellerbe. And now they brought in Paul Warlow and Corey Nelson, so who are legitimately good special teams players. And Warlow has a lot of starting experience in this league, both with Atlanta and Detroit. So they're much better equipped at the linebacker position as far as depth goes.
And then you go to corner, which might be one of the most competitive roster spots in all of football. Darby, Mills, Douglas, Jones, Maddox.
Yeah, I think the hope there is obviously that Sidney Jones can hit the ground running and be a really good player really early in his career. And if that happens, I think the Eagles are going to be fine. But there is going to be an issue. That's one we talked about, Donnell Pumphrey. It's going to be another storyline in the off season to see what Jim Schwartz has in his mind for that nickelback spot that Patrick Robinson played so well in last year. Ultimately, I think it'll be Jalen Mills to start. I think they'll start Jalen and Ronald Darby on the outside, and when they go in the nickel, Jones will come in on the outside, then they'll push Mills inside. And worst case scenario is if it doesn't work, then they do what they always do, and that's let Malcolm Jenkins handle the slot, who remains the most valuable defensive player on this team simply because he plays so many positions and he can do so many things. And it's a nice luxury to have because you can try, and you'll see this throughout the spring and summer. They'll run all these guys into the nickelback spot, Avonte Maddox as well, the rookie from Pitt. And if they can't handle it, come September, Thursday night against Atlanta, it'll be Malcolm Jenkins out there.
The one area, like safety, McLeod and Jenkins, they're very good. But if there was an injury there, that's one spot that you got to be a little concerned about.
Yeah, I think it is. Another undrafted kid you mentioned, Josh Adams, one to keep an eye on as well as Jeremy Reeves, because they had a lot of interest in him. They considered drafting him. He's got sort of cornerback in his background. He moved to safety. He's a big hitter, and they like him a lot. But if you think about how valuable Corey Graham was to this team, and by the way, Corey has not officially said he doesn't want to play. So that could be one of those late signings as well, because he's a guy that just comforts Jim Schwartz. And he understands what to do in his defense. And when Corey was here, what that enabled was him to move Malcolm Jenkins all over the formation. And, you know, it was interesting. After Jordan Hicks went down, we talk about Michael Kendricks. Malcolm played linebacker just as much as he played safety. That's how much he was used in that big nickel or dime package, whatever you want to call it. But the reason Jim Schwartz was able to go to that so often is because he had so much confidence in Corey Graham. As we stand here today, the Eagles don't have that player.
Yeah.
And they don't have the player they can put in there to where they would have the confidence to move Malcolm around in all those different spots. So that's something to keep an eye on.
Crazy to think how important a guy like Corey Graham was to winning the Super Bowl, that we really, don't give him a lot of credit. He's not the guy that comes rolling off your tongue.
Yeah, and you're right, because people don't think about it. Because it wasn't about making splash plays. It wasn't about, high-profile moments. It was just about giving Jim Schwartz the confidence to use so many different packages. And before he was here, he didn't have that confidence, and he wasn't able to use them. So it's more important than people think it is.
John McMullen, at JF McMullen on Twitter. Give him a follow there, of course, for all the Eagles and NFL coverage. Go to 97.3 ESPN.com. The offseason really here now. The draft is behind us, and we'll start to see the mini camps and roster formulation take shape for the 2018 Philadelphia Eagles. John, appreciate it, pal.
All right, thanks, Mike.
You got it, man. John McMullen, like all guests, appeared via the Boardwalk Honda hotline.